All right, guys, so it's our last unit before finals. And before we get started on going over the notes, I want to give a little quick intro about quadratic equations. That's what our last unit is on, is quadratic equations. Now remember, we've already done linear equations. And when we did linear equations, and yes, you should be writing this down somewhere in your notes, probably on the left-hand side of the first notes section. So on the left-hand side of page 67. When we did linear equations, what I want you to recall is that we had the standard form of a linear equation, and we had the slope-intercept form of a linear equation. And if you can recall, our standard form was a real pretty one. It was ax plus by equals c. And our slope-intercept form was just the easy to graph one. It was in y equals mx plus b form. Okay? So, hopefully there it is. All right, and remember, we could go back and forth between these two. But when we looked at them, standard form was pretty. Everything was whole numbers, no fractions. And slope-intercept form was in this form, but it was super easy to graph. We found my beginning point, and then we did the slope, and everything could be written in fractions. And you'll recall that my parent graph of linear equation was y equals x, right? So my beginning point was 0, and my slope was 1, so we went up 1 over 1, and that's what that graph looked like, of that linear equation. Now we are going to be doing quadratic equations. And quadratic equations are very similar to linear equations in that they also have a standard form, and they also have a graphing form, but we're going to call it vertex form. But what I want you to note about slope-intercept form and vertex form is those are the easy to graph ones. So your standard form of a quadratic equation is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So you'll notice everything is pretty. A, b, and c are whole numbers. We have a quadratic term. Remember last unit we talked about terms. This is a quadratic term, a linear term, and then we had a constant. Okay, so that's standard form, and we're going to talk about that today in page 67. My vertex form, which we have not gotten to yet, is going to look a little different. And in vertex form, this is going to be the one, and it's super, super easy to graph. I just want to make sure I don't. So it looks like this. Y equals a times h, x minus h squared plus k. And we're going to talk a little bit later about that vertex form, but this one is super, super easy to graph. And this is that standard form. And just a quick note, the parent graph of a quadratic equation is y equals x squared. That's my quadratic term. And the graph of this one takes on the shape of a parabola, which we'll talk about today. So that's a quick overview, linear equations versus quadratic equations, and I want you to see this video first. So now, next video, we're going to get started on page 67.